begin the year with Tsar Nicholas as the Tsar of the Russias. By the end of the year, by the time January, February 1918 rolls around, the Bolsheviks are in power. And how this came about, how did a little band, the smallest of the socialist parties in Europe, become the rulers of this vast nation, is the story that we're going to tell now. Okay, Engels remarked that when you start a revolution, you have no idea what you're going to end up with, is certainly apropos of this part of the story. Now, I schlepped along all these books up in the other location the last time, and I have them here for the class here, which are several books about Stalin's life, but also books about the revolution. I want to talk about two of those before I begin. The first, which isn't my book, but I took it out of the Chatham Library, is a book called A People's Tragedy, The History of the Russian Revolution by Orlando Figues. It's a big fat book, a lot of reading, but a very good author, very good style, and full of some interesting information. The other book I particularly want to recommend to you is a book that appeared just after the Russian Revolution, written by John Reed, a famous book called 10 Days That Shook the World. John Reed was a journalist, a socialist. He was an eyewitness to these events, and some of his writings will appear in the lecture today. It's an easy read, it's very lively. He was there with his wife, Ellen Bryant. I forgot her first name for the minute. And anybody who picks it up will find it very enjoyable because of the style of writing. Okay, so let's begin our lecture because we have a lot to cover because so much has happened. Okay, now let's go back. I'm going to go back a little bit just before the revolution. That guy in the center with all the women surrounding him, that's Rasputin. Okay, Rasputin was an infamous character. It's interesting to just tell the story, but what it illustrates is I would call it the degeneration of the Tsarist regime. He is a monk. He had the power of hypnotism. You can almost get hypnotized looking at his eyes over there. And he promised to cure the Tsar's son of the hemophilia that he was suffering from. And he was greatly trusted by the Tsar's wife, the Tsarina Alexandrovich. He was eventually murdered. He was murdered by one of the people around the court. The aristocrats hated his guts. He was bisexual, and he had a rendezvous with one of the, I forgot the prince's name, but he went to this guy's house, a handsome young man, for the homosexual rendezvous. And while he was there, they fed him cyanide-laced cake, but it didn't do any good. So they fed him cyanide-laced wine, but it didn't do any good. So they brought him over to look at an icon. I don't know why he was looking at an icon, but when his back was turned, they shot him. And he fell to the ground. They figured he was dead. So they ran out to get his overcoat, wrap him up in the overcoat, dispose of the body. While they were out looking for the overcoat, he got up. And he went out trying to get away from the estate. When they saw him out there, they shot him again and again, and they beat him, and they finally killed him and threw him in the river. And that was the end of Rasputin. But the fact that Rasputin even existed, this picture, I think, was taken some years before 1917, had tremendous influence on the government, and some of the ministers were afraid of him, and he got his friends appointed, etc., etc. Again, it illustrates the degeneration of the Tsar's regime. Now here is 1917. This is a New Year's Eve party. At that point, things were going so badly for the regime that people felt disaster was around the corner. And this is kind of the last fling I don't know if you can see this very well, but I don't know if oh, let me do it over here. But up here, it says Rule Britannia. There was, of course, the war going on at the time, and the Russians were allied with the British and the French. And this is the last frame, baby. You better watch out what's happening next. Okay, so as we said before, widespread army mutiny. The Tsar coming to the point that he wants to dismiss this, the Duma. The Duma didn't have that much power at that point. And the Duma refusing to resign, and you have the abdication. One of the things to bear in mind about this period is that while there was a Duma, there was also the Soviets. These were, Soviet in Russian means committee. And the Soviets were, let's call them ad hoc groups. There was the Petrograd Soviet, the Moscow Soviet, and Soviets throughout the Russian countryside, and soldier Soviets, worker Soviets, peasant Soviets, all had risen up in the years during the war, particularly as 1916 came to an end. And these Soviets had power as much as the Duma had power. And when this revolution occurs, there will be two centers of power. One in the Duma, or the Provisional Government, and a second power, almost equal and finally greater than the government power, in the Soviets. And also, bear in mind, the Soviets were very democratic organizations, and they were not dominated by the Bolsheviks. Despite the fact that the eventual state was called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, with the word Soviet, and they're always referring to Soviet, in this period, the Bolsheviks were a definite minority in the Soviets. The Tsar advocates in favor of his brother Michael. Basically, he didn't want to let the crown go to his son. The son was sickly, and so he advocated in favor of Michael. So in fact, Michael was the last Tsar of the Russians. Here is a picture of Michael and his wife, a rather handsome fellow. I should have brought it along, but I forgot. There's another history of the revolution that Trotsky wrote. It's a big, big, fat thing. I guess the volume I have is 3 volumes. And Trotsky writes in the beginning of his history that he's going to write an objective history. But when you read it, he's full of jibes and cuts at everybody. And he has a very stringent cut at Michael. He calls him a stupid man who was more interested in horse racing than anything else. But it's a very sad story, the story of Michael. And when I was asked about, at the last time I gave this lecture, I was asked, whatever happened to Michael? He was in prison in the city of Perm. And I got this off the internet. I'm going to leave it here for those who are interested. It's 25 pages of a very sad and sort of kind of bitter, it's not even bittersweet, it's just a bitter little story about the adventures, particularly of this lady here, Natasha, his wife. He was assassinated at the same time that the Tsar was, but he was in a different city. So I'll leave this out here for you people here in Great Barrington. I'll bring copies of this when I come up to Pittsfield next week. And that's the story of the last Tsar. But now let's get on with the main story. The exiles return. Now they're coming back from 4 corners. The first one to get back is our man, Stalin. Stalin had been kept up in a prison camp just north of the Arctic Circle. He's called down to a town north-south, closer to the Trans-Siberian Railroad, to be for a physical. They want to, now they're going to bring people in the prisons into the army because the war isn't going well. But Stalin doesn't pass the physical. One arm is shorter than the other. He's got 2 toes that don't separate. He limps. He's got physical problems. He's a short guy with some physical problems. And he's staying at that time in the same house as Kamenev, another Bolshevik. This particular Kamenev is the guy whose picture you saw last week that was blacked out. And Kamenev was eventually killed during the purges. He was a main rival of Stalin later on, but at this point, he's his buddy, and they're in the same house. By the way, Kamenev's wife is Trotsky's sister, okay? And Stalin, who was like to smoke cheap tobacco, it made a problem for his wife, but yet Stalin kept puffing away while he was there in their house. Anyway, Stalin arrives, there's an amnesty, and just in the middle of March, Stalin and Kamenev arrived. They immediately got into the mix of politics. Pravda, which is the organ of the Bolshevik Party, is being edited by Molotov. Stalin comes in, immediately dismisses Molotov, demotes him, and becomes the editor of Pravda. And that's going on in March. At this point, the Bolsheviks and the socialists, the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries, have taken power. The Tsar has abdicated, and the biggest issue is whether to continue the war. Okay? Realize that Russia is a major ally of Britain and France. The war is raging. Britain, France, and America has not gotten into the war yet, want the Russians to continue fighting. Should the Russians continue fighting the Germans? And there is a dispute about this within the Bolshevik Party. Lenin is calling for an end to the war, for peace and establishment of a socialist regime. Stalin and Kamenev are supporting the government continuing the war against the Germans. Okay, Lenin comes in from Zurich. What's going on with Lenin? Lenin is in Zurich. He wants to get to Russia. How's he going to get to Russia from Zurich in Switzerland? He has to go through Germany. Germany is fighting Russia. So why would the Germans let a Russian come through? Well, what do you think? He's against the war. He's the kind of guy they want to get into Russia. So they provide him with a sealed train. He goes through Germany in a sealed train to Finland, and he comes in from Finland. Once this happens, everybody knows about it. There's a charge against Lenin that he's a German agent, okay? And this will come to play a role in the future events. But anyway, in he comes from Zurich, and here's a painting of that, so-called triumphantly coming in. And who's this guy up here, do you think? He's painted in. He wasn't really there. Do you recognize him? It's our boy, right? Right. They painted him in. Just like they took people out of photographs, they put people into paintings. So there he is again with Lenin, as Lenin comes in at the Finland station. Okay, now, finally, the last guy to arrive is these two fellas that come in from New York, Trotsky and Bukharin. Trotsky, as I told you last week, had been living in the Bronx, and Bukharin was living somewhere in Manhattan. In they come from New York. And now you have the Bolshevik Party pretty much constituted in Petrograd. Okay, now that's March. And here we come into April. We got the Lenin's April thesis. Kamenev, Stalin are supporting the Provisional Government, the continuance of the war. Lenin, right after he gets off that train, about a day later, makes a speech to the Bolshevik Party conference. And in speech, he declares no compromising with the Provisional Government. The war should be opposed. And everybody said, wow, where are you coming from? We got to fight the Germans. After that speech, Skobelow, Prince Lvov, whose name is down here at the bottom, was the premier at the time. Kerensky was the minister of justice, as I recall. And he tells Prince Lvov, Lenin is a has-been. So much for pundits, okay? Okay? Now, here comes Kerensky. Kerensky is a politician, a very clever politician. By the way, as I talk about Kerensky, Jack Mechanic up there at Pittsfield met Kerensky when Kerensky was in exile in California. In Jack's varied career, he tells me as Kerensky was an old man at the time, he met him out there. Well, anyway, Kerensky was obsessed with Napoleon, and because Napoleon rose in a revolutionary period, Kerensky could see himself rising up into prominence, and he did achieve prominence, but not what he was looking for. He, at one time, he was always holding his arm in his pocket like that, or in a sling. And as you see people joke, they said he had wore out his arm by too much handshaking. Okay? Now the war is going badly. And Kerensky at this point became the Minister of War. And what does he advocate? People, everybody here must be familiar with it. He advocates a surge. He advocates an offensive. We're going to have a surge, and it's going to boost the morale, and we're going to have victory over the Germans, and it's going to reverse our fortunes. And it doesn't reverse any fortunes. It's a failure. The Germans resist this offensive, and you have a great deal of discontent. Okay, there is Kerensky. You see where his arm is, right there. This is Kerensky down here. And now the offensive fails. So when the offensive fails, the Bolsheviks, the social revolutionaries, and most importantly, the Petrograd Soviet consider that this is a time to overthrow the Provisional Government. And they're going to organize a demonstration in July. And there's a lot of back and forth. Should they or shouldn't they? A lot of considerations are in balance here. One is, do we have the power to do that? Will we be able to do it? Another consideration is Marxist theory. According to Marxist theory, there are stages of development. And what Marx said was that first you have feudalism, then you have capitalism, and that will develop into communism. Russia was essentially feudalism. The Tsar, you didn't realize it, the theory of the Russian Tsarism was not that he was the leader. He owned the people. The people belonged to him like property. They were his slaves in their theory of government. This was feudalism plus. So how could you go from feudalism plus directly into socialism? Marx says you have to have capitalism, so don't overthrow the Provisional Government. So that was that argument. But there was also the argument, is this the right time? And Lenin vacillated. He wasn't sure, should I or shouldn't I? Usually he was very determinative, but at this point he wasn't. Okay, they have the demonstration. The demonstration is fired upon by the opposition. There is a scene in the street as to people getting killed and running around, and the whole thing is a mess. And there is no leadership, nothing is happening. There is at one point, the demonstrators come to the headquarters of the Petrograd Soviet, and one of them shouts at him, "Take power, you son of a bitch!" As if they didn't want, they wanted the Soviets to seize power from the Provisional Government, but it didn't happen. So this was pretty bad from the Bolshevik point of view. Kerensky, Lvov quits, and Kerensky becomes the premier. You have to realize, we always remember Kerensky as the man in charge of the Provisional Government, but this is July 1917. By October 1917, the Bolsheviks would have taken power. So it's a very short time that Kerensky was in charge of the Provisional Government. And also, I want to remind you, it's called the Provisional Government because when the Tsar resigned, they agreed to convene a Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly was going to represent all of Russia, just like our Constitutional Convention, something like that, and establish the democratic government of Russia. So it was in favor of the Constituent Assembly that the revolution was conducted legally, and they were provisional until the Constituent Assembly convened. And in fact, the Constituent Assembly did convene, but not quite yet. Okay? Now, do you know who this guy is? Anybody know who he is? This is Lenin. You don't recognize him because he shaved off his beard, and he's wearing a wig, and he put on a hat, and he's on the run. He's on the run because once that demonstration failed, and once that occurred, Kerensky's government declared him a criminal, and declared that he was a traitor, and declared that he was a German agent, based on the fact that he had come across into Russia from Switzerland in a sealed train on behalf of the Germans. So Lenin has to scoot out of town. He first hides. Well, let me go back up a little bit. Stalin at that time was the editor of Pravda, and Stalin was staying in the house of Sergei Aluliev. Aluliev, an electrical craftsman, was somebody that Stalin had known down in the Crimea. And Aluliev eventually became Stalin's father-in-law. He married, his first wife had died, and he shortly is going to marry Aluliev's daughter. Aluliev's daughter, Nadja, at this point was 16 years old. Stalin was 38 years old. But he was staying in Aluliev's house. And Lenin needed a place to hide right away, and Aluliev had a little shed in the backyard. And Lenin hid out in that shed for a couple of days, and then finally made it up to Finland.
They stand if Stalin was head of Pravda and the Bolsheviks were suppressed, how did he remain in that job?
They did not suppress everybody, but they were after Lenin, they were after Zinoviev, they were after, I don't remember if they were after Trotsky. I think Trotsky volunteered to be imprisoned at the time, but they were not going after all the Bolsheviks. Okay? Okay, where I went backwards, excuse me. No, why not? Oh, so as to just answer Bob's last remark, Stalin remains at large, and he's staying with the Alulievs. This is a story about Nadja, where Nadja had fallen in love with him, and he with her, and they got married a year later. At that point, she was 17, and he was about 40 years old. So Lenin is up in Finland, right? And he's sending now everything that happens from this point on, from July until the October Revolution. Lenin has to communicate through somebody because he's not there on the scene. And his vehicle for communication is Stalin. He's sending letters to Stalin, and Stalin is playing a key role in keeping the rest of the Bolsheviks aware of Lenin's instructions. Okay, so now we're moving into August. So I told you, this thing gets complicated. Here's this guy, Kornilov. Kornilov is a Tsarist general. The Tsar is advocated. Some of the generals quit and they go into exile, but not Kornilov. Kornilov stays on and is the commander of the army for the Provisional Government. And again, Trotsky has some great comments about him. He says he was brave but stupid. It was mainly, as far as he was concerned, the only things that could happen is that the landowner should earn land, the manufacturer should manufacture, the merchant should sell, and that was the end of everything else. That was the end of politics as far as he was concerned. But in fact, Kornilov is going to try and overthrow the Provisional Government. At some point, Kerensky, who was aware that these Tsarist generals hated him, including Kornilov, is going to send a message to Kornilov dismissing him. Kornilov is going to respond by saying, I'm here to save the revolution. And he's going to come in with an army. Kerensky knew that he was being targeted by these generals. He had to be aware of that. Kornilov acts to overthrow, but he's thwarted by the Soviets. Kerensky is the provisional government. The Soviets are this informal government, or informal group. When this army that Kornilov has outside of Petrograd, out in the outskirts, and starts to come in on the trains, the railway workers stop him, the Soviet committees and the Soviet soldiers, Soviets, they stop him, they convince the soldiers to desert him, and the whole thing fails. Now, once that happens, it's clear that the provisional government no longer has any power. That the power now, this is in August, the power resides now in the Soviets. And the struggle for the revolution shifts from the provisional government to the cockpit of the Soviets. And that was Kornilov's contribution to world history. Okay, here is the words of John Reed. I like his style. It's that early 20th century romantic style. In September, General Kornilov marched on Petrograd to make himself military dictator of Russia. Behind him was suddenly revealed the mailed fist of the bourgeoisie, boldly attempting to crush the revolution. And this is another from John Reed. Along 1,000 miles of front, the millions of men in the Russian army stirred like the sea rising, pouring into the capital. There are hundreds upon hundreds of delegations crying, peace, peace. I went across the river to the Cirque Madame to one of the great popular meetings which occurred all over the city. The bare, gloomy amphitheater lit by tiny lights from a thin wire, packed from the ring up, sweeping the grimy benches to the very roof. Soldiers, sailors, workmen. A soldier was speaking. Comrades, the people at the top were always calling upon us to sacrifice. Show me what I'm fighting for. Is it Constantinople or is it free Russia? Is it democracy? Can you prove to me that I'm defending the revolution? I'll fight without capital punishment. Now these two ideas are interesting. One is this one on Constantinople, and the other capital punishment. In March, the provisional government, the then minister of provisional government, was revealed to have signed a letter ratifying or agreeing to this outcome of the war. Should the war end in victory for the Allies, Russia would then be in control of Constantinople, now known as Istanbul. Russia has always wanted to get an outlet to the Mediterranean through that point. But then the soldiers said, why are we fighting for this imperialist aim? This is not what we want to fight for. So we have this point of, why am I fighting? Am I fighting for Constantinople? And that minister had to disown that letter, and eventually he had to leave the government. And the other capital punishment, one of the first things that they did at the revolution was to abolish capital punishment for soldiers. Well, the generals and the officer class said, how are we going to maintain discipline if we can't kill the soldiers who disobey? We have to have capital punishment. And so that was also an issue at the time, the abolition of capital punishment, particularly in the army. Okay, so now we get to October. Okay, so this is when everything is going to come to a head. Lenin comes back. Now he's finally made up. Now he's made up his mind. There's no question about it. It's not like July when it's neither one way or another. Now he's going to call for armed insurrection. Kamenev and Zinoviev, two of the leaders in the Bolshevik Party, are opposed to it, and so there's a debate about it. And the debate doesn't always go Lenin's way. Before this actually happens, many of the delegates want to continue the war, and they don't want a reversal, an attempt at armed uprising. Okay? So, it's the night of the overthrow. John Reed tells us he goes to dinner that day. And he's sitting at the table, and the waiter comes up to him, and the waiter says to him, "Would you mind moving to the back room? We're expecting shooting here at around 6 o'clock. This is a revolution." At that day, people went to the theater. The opera was played. Life went on normally in Petrograd at the same time that the Bolsheviks swarmed into the government center and seized power. Kerensky scooted out of town the night before. A couple of the deputies were still there. Here's a picture, let me see if I can show you this, from the, some of you may remember the movie Reds. I took this from that movie. Wonder if this is going to work, Bob. Well. That's Trotsky. Provisional Government. There's Lenin. Okay. We go back to the slideshow if I can do that. How do I do that?
Current slide.
What do I do?
Current slide.
Current slideshow.
That's custom.
Current slide. There we go. Okay. So the Bolsheviks assumed power. It's very bloodless, despite what we might imagine what a revolution might have been like. I suppose by the time this happened, the Provisional Government was so dispirited with the Kornilov affair and with the power of the Soviets that they could no longer resist this. Kerensky tries, as I'll show in the next slide, to recover his position, but it won't work. Okay, he's trying to get these arrows off here. Okay, where we stand right now is they've assumed power, but Kerensky is out there with the Tsarist generals, with the white generals, and he makes an ineffective run at Petrograd, but it doesn't work. In the meantime, in town, Lenin forms a government formed not of the Bolsheviks alone, but of the Bolsheviks allied with the socialist revolutionaries. At a conference before this occurs, the Mensheviks and the right revolutionaries walk out of the conference because they did not want to be associated with this overthrow, and everybody thought it would only last a short time and Lenin's Bolshevik party would be defeated. And Trotsky yells back at them, this is a famous quote, "Go to the dustbin of history. Go, go," as they walk out. You're going into the dustbin of history. And in fact, I guess they did go into the dustbin of history, but so did Trotsky. That's the big Okay, now what was Stalin's role in all of this? He was, this phrase will come back, Trotsky's phrase, the gray blur. He was out of the limelight in a way. Let's say just off the edges of the limelight. He runs the Central Committee, which is a kind of bureaucratic job. He's editing the party newspaper, Pravda. He's the liaison between Lenin and the party, sending the instructions that Lenin is sending in from Finland. And he has very low visibility. But he's active, and he's pretty, let me call it a cog, an important cog in the wheel. Now, in John Reed's book, John Reed died shortly during the Civil War, so he never knew Stalin to become the power that we know as we know the background of history. So to him, this is what it looked like when he wrote his book in 1919. He tells us that the reading out the names of those who are in the Communist Committee and the Bolshevik Committee, and look where Stalin is. Everybody, almost everybody else, in fact, nobody else is below him. It's the last name on the list. I put this arrow in and I put the bolding in, but John Reed didn't do that. Okay, so he's not, to the world at large, Dugashvili, the Tsarian Dugashvili, is not really somebody that we have to be concerned about. Some of these, oh, okay.
But when did he become really known as Stalin?
He was known as Stalin. As you see in this, he is known as Stalin.
Of course, the Russians are great for having multiple names.
No, but they had these names as code names, and then finally, you can see Trotsky's actual name is Bronstein, and Lenin's actual name is Vladimir Ulyanov. See, all these guys have not all of them, but a lot of them have pseudonyms. Why did they? I don't know why they did it. But Stalin, Man of Steel. Okay, so that was why. Kamenev is the hammer. Lenin is a river near where he was born, the Yenisei River. I don't know where Trotsky comes from. So finally, in February, they have the Constituent Assembly. They've been dying for this Constituent Assembly. It goes all the way back to the Decembrists. That's all the way back in the 1820s when Nicholas the First became Tsar. And there was a call for a Constituent Assembly. So this is the Constituent Assembly comes in. The Bolsheviks do not have a majority. They have only about 1/3 of the members. There are about 1,000 or 1,200 people. They have one meeting, and Lenin sends the Red Army in, and the soldiers come in, and they shut down the Constituent Assembly. It only met for one day, and after that, the Bolsheviks suppressed it. So with all of this push, I think when I look at this thing, while overthrowing the Provisional Government was a big deal, this really ends and really represents the revolution. This is where any hope for an alternative government, at least from these forces, is completely suppressed. Okay? Now, this is where we stand. I'm showing you this map because what it shows you is the German army, where the German army was when they started in November 1917. Oops, I'm moving it. Here. I want to get back. Oh. Here we go. Okay. This line here is the front line in November 1917. Okay? By March 1918, that's 4 months later, the line is now here. The Russian army stops fighting. Okay? The Bolsheviks take over. There isn't any push anymore to fight. And from the German point of view, if they want to advance the front, they get on a train, they go to the next station, they get off the train, and now the front is at the next station. And they just keep moving through the Russian territory that way. Okay? And by January, in January, they're saying, well, we're not going to fight anymore. Now we've taken over, we're the Bolsheviks, we're in power, and the Germans send a couple of airplanes over Petrograd, drop a few bombs, and they realize that they are not able to, they have to do something about how to deal with the Germans. They have to come to a conclusion. Trotsky, Kamenev are sent down to this town here, Brest-Litovsk. You see it here, Brest-Litovsk. It's in Poland. The Germans are ready to talk to them about ending the war. The Allies are very much against this. The Allies want to keep that Eastern Front up, and you'll see some of the results of their wishes in a few slides later on. Trotsky and Kamenev set out in a car from Petrograd to drive, they're going to drive down here to Brest-Litovsk. And they have a delegation with them. The delegation represents the workers and peasants of Russia. They look around the car, they realize there's a worker here, but there's no peasant. They got to have a peasant. Before they get out of town, they see some old guys with a peasant coat walking along the street, and they yell out, "Tovarich, where are you going?" So he says, "I'm going to the railroad station. I'm going back to visit my family." "No, Tovarich, we'll give you a lift." And they get him in the car, and they take him to Brest-Litovsk as the representative of the Soviet peasantry. When they get there to have a dinner before the negotiations, and this old guy is sitting there, and the waiter comes around and says, "Would you like your claret red claret or white claret?" So he turns to the German general next to him. He says, "Which one is stronger?" Anyway, they have this meeting, and of course, one of the things, I should back up again. One of the things that impelled Lenin and the Bolsheviks to carry out this revolution in the first place is a belief that Europe was waiting for the spark. One of their publications was called Iskra, the spark, Russian for the spark. They felt that if they have a revolution, it will set off and ignite all of Europe. Before the First World War, at the Second Socialist International, all the socialist parties agreed not to support a war, should there be a war. There was a great peace movement in Europe before World War I. I don't know how many of you know Mother's Day is coming up soon, but Mother's Day was part of that peace movement. Mother's Day started by mothers objecting to an impending war around the turn of the 20th century. And the Second International, all the socialist parties agreed, the German, the English, the French, they all agreed to oppose the war. And when the war came, they all voted for the war. The Germans, the French, the English, except the Russians. The Russians, the Bolsheviks, and the other Russian socialist parties opposed the war. But now, Lenin thought, and the others thought, that with their revolution, all the other soldiers and all the other workers and all the other proletariat would revolt, and they wouldn't have to fight the war. We won't have to fight the Germans because the German proletariat will join us. And they were expecting that. That's why they sat on their hands in January, in December and January. But by February 1918, it was clear that they weren't revolting, it wasn't going to happen, and that there was an army out there that could fight. And so they sent Trotsky and Kamenev to negotiate. And the negotiation with the Germans was a dismemberment of the Tsarist Empire, the Russian Empire. And I don't know if I have the slide, but let me just go through. Poland was removed from Russian domination, which they had. Poland had actually belonged to Russia before World War I. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, thank you, Lithuania. Ukraine was removed. Belarus was removed. A big, tremendous chunk, pretty much defined by this line on this map, removed from the Russian control. But what did the Russians, what did they get from this? The Soviets got recognition. They had signed a treaty with one of the great powers. They were, in a sense, legally the government of Russia. And the war was brought to a close, which was a great, great benefit to them. And so that was, and by the way, just want to point out something to you. If you look down here, these are the Turks. The Turks are in here. And up here, these are the English. The English are up here. They've got all kinds of foreign armies around them. And while this is March 1918, the war isn't over. The Turks may pull back, but the English are not going to pull back. And pretty soon you're going to have some more action, as you're about to find out. Okay, the Germans, as you see from this item from some encyclopedia that I own, the armistice is declared on February 20th, after the Germans had launched a vicious attack. Notice over here what's going on. The English are pushing the Turks out of the Middle East. This is where the English are getting control of Palestine at the same time that this is all happening. And finally, the Russians sign a peace treaty with the Germans in Brest-Litovsk on March 14th. At the same time, we're getting for great battles over here on Western Front, Marshal Foch is taking over. And in a short time, by April, the Americans are in the war. And during the summer of 1918, the Americans are going to come into the war. Okay? The treaty, they withdraw from the war, and they have lost all of the territory that I just described. The Civil War intensifies. When we think about the Civil War in the United States, and we feel what the tremendous event that was, and it raged over our country and had effects for years and years, it still has effects today. The number of deaths in the American Civil War was 500,000. Does anybody have any idea how many people died in this Civil War? 10 million. 10 million people. This was a horrible, horrible Holocaust. And while we think of our Civil War as having lasting effects of 100 or 150 years, the Russian Civil War had immense effects on the psychology of everybody involved. And this is particularly true of our subject, Stalin. Stalin was in the center of this war. Actually, what do I know about really what went on in his head? But you got to realize what a tremendous impact this thing had meant. The level of cruelty, the level of blood, the level of oppression that went on. Jews, for example, for Jews, this was a terrible problem. When the Reds came in, the Jews were identified with the upper class and with the landowners and the kulaks, and they were decimated because of that. When the whites came in, the Jews were identified with the Bolsheviks and the revolution, and they were decimated because of that. Burning entire villages, killing people at random. It went on and on. Okay, let's have a look at what was going on when I said that there were armies in Russia. Remember when I started out this talk, I said a lot of things are happening in a short space of time. This is only about a year ago the Tsar was in charge. Up here in the north, you have the British, the Americans, and the Italians. Over here on the east, you have the Finns fighting them. You have, of course, the White Russian, the Lets, the Baltic Germans, the Lithuanians. Down here, the Poles are pushing in. More White Russians. Ukrainians are fighting them. The French are down here. Romanians are coming in. Down here, you have the British. Again, the British. Out here, you have the Czechs. I'll say more about the Czechs. This is wild, but I'll save that. And out there in Siberia, the Japanese have landed in Vladivostok. The Americans have come in with an army in Vladivostok. Prince Lvov, when he left his post, he went around the world and he went to speak to Wilson, and he convinced Wilson to send a contingent. Now, what are these foreign countries doing there? They're trying to get the Russians back in the war. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk took the Russians out of the war and left the Germans with no fighting on the Eastern Front. They want them to be back in the war and fighting on the Eastern Front. This is still this is now March, April 1918. The war isn't over yet. In fact, there's some big battles going to occur on the Western Front.
Stan, can you speak to the Ukrainians? They apparently were almost universally on the side of White Russia at this time?
Well, the Ukrainians, like almost all nations in the Russian Empire, or in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or in the Ottoman Empire, these were empires made up of various nations, and all these nations wanted some independence. And the Ukrainians were one of those who wanted independence, just like the Poles. And so the Germans granted it to them. And they established a parliament, a Rada, as it's called. I don't know if the current Ukrainian government calls it a Rada, but that was their name for the parliament. So they were there defending their country against the Reds. And they were, of course, were sponsored by the Germans at the time. Okay? Now,
later on, Stalin really did a number on
oh yeah, Stalin did a number. And it's funny about Stalin doing a number because Stalin had come out of Georgia, which wanted its independence also. But Stalin somehow converted himself into a Russian nationalist and behaved just as much a Russian nationalist as if he had been born in Moscow. It was a strange transformation. Okay, now what about Stalin? He had many roles during the Civil War. Here is one of his roles. He was sent down by Lenin to this town, Tsaritsyn. It's on the Tsaritsyn River. And its name during World War II was Stalingrad. Its name nowadays is Volgograd. At that time, it was called Tsaritsyn. Tsaritsyn, as you can see here, is down there at a point which was a large agricultural center, and the mission that he was sent down was to keep the whites were coming in from this end, and there were whites coming in from this end. You can see it isn't too far for the whites to reach that point, and make sure that wheat and foodstuff were delivered up north to the cities of Moscow, Petrograd, etc. When he got down there, he found that the commanders, the officers holding the front were largely Tsarist officers. Look, the Reds had support among the proletariat, but you needed officers to run to conduct the war. And where did they come from? They came from the old Tsarist officer corps. But Stalin didn't like them, he didn't trust them, he had them rounded up. He rounded up almost 100 officers, had them put on a barge, had the barge towed out into the river with the intention of sinking it. He was going to kill them. And they heard about it. At this point, Trotsky was the commissar of war. And they didn't get along. They actually hated each other, put it mildly. When they found out about it up at Petrograd, Lenin included, they sent him a telegram to stop. They sent a delegation down there to stop. But this is the indication of his ruthlessness, an indication of the kind of action that a person like him was going to take. And they put a stop to it. Also, at that time, he had come down with Nadia Aliyulov. She was his secretary at the time. And shortly after these events, Nadia married him. She operated as his secretary as he moved around from place to place. This is one place he was in. At another point, he was up in Petrograd. He did a similar thing up there, rejecting something that the officer corps had recommended. He always knew more than the guy next to him. He was a good man who believed that he knew everything. And later on, you'll see one of the mistakes that he made that had large consequences, even up to World War II. Okay, here's a picture of that fight. The whites, top heavy with officers. The Reds, bottom heavy with troops. The two forces coming against each other. And a lot of these troops would leave. There was a tremendous amount of desertion, you know, and people had to have iron discipline. As far as the death penalty is concerned, that was gone by the boards. There would be a death penalty. You could be sure. Okay, this is Trotsky, Commissar of War. Trotsky was all over the place. He was in charge of this whole thing. And the fact that the Bolsheviks were victorious, you know what, it's pretty surprising when you look at the map I showed you before, to believe that they could have been victorious when surrounded by so many armies. And Trotsky is given great credit for that victory. Let me show you from another movie. I think this is from Dr. Zhivago. This movie, there's a character in this movie called Strelnikov, who is based on Trotsky. I'll just give you a little feeling for this.
That's Strelnikov.
That was a picture of the armored train they had constructed for the movie, an armored train. And that armored train moved all the way around. You see, in that Russia, in fact, even up to World War II in Russia, you couldn't ride around in automobiles very well. You had to use the trains because of the mud and because of the level of development. So it was pretty much a train-dominated war. Here are the whites. General Alexiev up there in the upper left, General Denikin. Denikin was leading an army coming up from the south. Admiral Kolchak. Admiral Kolchak was leading an army coming in from Siberia. Get this guy's an admiral, and he's leading an army in Siberia. But there he is. And then there's Baron Wrangel. He comes in at the end. One of the things about this picture and about this story is, and this is similar, I think, to the French Revolution. In order for them to work together, they needed something cohesive, and they didn't have it. The Tsar was in prison. In fact, killing the Tsar had to do with keeping these people from uniting. If the Tsar would live, if the Tsar had escaped, if, they would have had somebody to unite around. The Tsar might have appointed one of them as a commanding general. But as it is, they didn't work together. At some point, Denikin has a great deal of success. He starts to push a salient all the way up, and he starts to get close to Moscow. But it's just a salient with the two sides of the salient open to attack, and he gets attacked. And so he fails. And they don't synchronize with each other. They don't have a united front. They don't have the war conducted in the same, on a global basis, but each one is conducting their own campaign. Okay, now the Tsar is killed. This is July, I have trouble reading this myself, July 20th, 1918. Why is the Tsar killed? Look carefully at this thing. Nicholas shot on July 16th when it was feared that Czechoslovaks might seize him. Czechoslovaks? What the heck are they doing in the middle of this? Here's what happened. It's the Czech Brigade. Austro-Hungarian Empire extends over all these countries, including Czechoslovakia. There are nationalists in Czechoslovakia who want freedom from the Austro-Hungarian king. And they are fighting along with the Russians. They're on the Eastern Front. They're fighting the Austro-Hungarian Russian army on behalf of Czech nationalism. They're not interested in the Russian Revolution, but the Russian Revolution comes along, and there's an armistice, and they can't fight for Czechoslovakia anymore, for freedom of Czechoslovakia. But they are an integrated group of soldiers. There's tens of thousands of them. They're trained. They can't desert. There's no place for them to go home. They have to get home to Czechoslovakia. Their plan is to head out east across Siberia, get to Vladivostok, get on a ship, go all the way around the world, get back to Western Europe, and get back into the fight now on the Western Front. And so they start out, the Czech Brigade, they start out, and the Bolsheviks are letting them go. They get to some town, and the soldiers get into a fight with Red Army soldiers, and they kill some of them, and then the cry comes up, and Trotsky declares that they're going to get disarmed. Well, you're not going to disarm 10, 20,000 armed, trained men. They don't get disarmed. They now join the whites. That was a stupid thing. They join the whites, and now they're fighting on the side of Kolchak. And they're coming in with Kolchak from Siberia, and they're getting close to where the Tsar is. And that's when they killed the Tsar. Because they're afraid that these Czech guys, who are tough to fight, would be successful and rescue the Tsar. And here they are in Vladivostok. They finally reached some conclusion. As I remember, what happened is, after a while, they turned on Kolchak, and they turned in Kolchak. So Kolchak is turned in, he's executed by the Red Army, and the Red Army lets these guys go. And they finally get out to Vladivostok.
To the United States?
Yeah, to try to get back. But of course, by November 18, the war is over, and Czechoslovakia gets its freedom anyway. Worldwide reaction. This is when the Cheka gets going. Lenin goes in July 1918, he goes to a factory to make a speech. And one of the socialist revolutionary, an SR, by the name of Vanya Kaplan, comes up behind him and shoots him. The bullet goes into his neck, it resides in his neck. I don't think they ever get the bullet out. And his lungs fill up with blood, and he's pretty much going to be gone. But he does survive. He dies later. He dies, I think, in 1924. But once that happens, they institute a Red Terror. Nothing like the level of terror that Stalin finally instituted, but it's the beginnings of it. And the so-called Cheka begins to round up, and all the opposition parties are suppressed.
Say again, the Cheka?
The Cheka, C-H-E-C-K-A, Cheka. And it stands for some Russian, whatever.
Heck.
Yeah. At the same time, this is where you have newspapers begin to speak about the Red Menace. Everything that Lenin was hoping for is what the West fears. And this conflict between what Lenin was hoping for and what the West fears, it sparks the rest of the 20th century. Until the collapse of the Soviet Union, and even today, the fear of this force is what has propelled the history of our Western history. Crisis in the fight against Bolshevism, the new military menace to be overcome in the East to make victory secure. Why the Russians fall back. This is a whole story about why the whites are not winning the war. And there's a great deal of fear in the West that they can't keep Russia in the war. Bear in mind also, as we'll be talking later on about the Second World War, at this point, Roosevelt is the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in Wilson's government, and Churchill, if I remember right, was in charge of the Admiralty in the British government. And they were both very interested and very dismayed about Russia withdrawing from this war. You'll see later when we talk about World War II that this fear of Russia withdrawing from the war in the same way that these Bolsheviks did played on those minds in regard to Stalin and World War II. A fear that he would withdraw from the war. Remember what I said, because we'll take this up again. Okay, you have the intervention, as I showed you, of the powers trying to keep Russia in the war. I don't know how you're going to keep them in a war, but making a war against them, but that seems like you're multiplying your war problems this way. But that's what they did. And finally, in 1920, after one or another, I don't want to go through all the campaigns because we'll be here all day, but there are many campaigns. Stalin is involved in some of them, and the last campaign is Baron Wrangel coming up from the Crimea. The biggest threat of all was Kolchak coming in from Siberia, although the most deep penetration was Denikin coming up toward Moscow, which was stopped under the command of Frunz. Frunz was one of the Bolsheviks' leaders. He died in an unfortunate way. He died in the 20s, but they called their military college the Frunz Institute. So Gorky was once asked, who was more cruel, the whites or the reds? And this is his reply, both equally, because they were Russians on both sides. I'm going to show you a picture now that I didn't show the first time I did this class because I felt it was too shocking, but I rethought it. This is a shocking picture, but it's emblematic of the cruelty involved. There are other atrocities that I don't care to describe because of their horror. They remind one of the Grand Provisional. But this is a shocking photograph. There's a Polish soldier. He's been stripped naked, hung by one ankle from a tree and beaten to death. And you can see the guy standing around him. It's not just a few people. That picture and its multiplication by millions and millions inscribes in the Bolshevik and in the Russian and in the Soviet culture what went on afterwards. It's emblematic of the kind of cruelty and oppression that you saw in the later period.
So the 10 million people that you spoke of that were killed, but mostly between 1918 and 1920. Is that your period?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there really was a far smaller number during the, we call World War I.
Oh yeah, during the actual fighting with the Germans was much smaller. A good book on fighting with the Russians is a book by Solzhenitsyn. I can't remember the name of it. I think it's called 1914. Now, what was Stalin's missteps? He disobeyed orders, which was, I don't know what was with that. Anyway, he was in charge. He was the commissar of the Red Army pushing against the Poles. Now, here's the Poles. The Poles have been under Russian sovereignty for years and years. Now the Germans freed them. Now we're in the period of 1918. There's no more Germans. The Brest-Litovsk Treaty has gone out the window because the Germans went out the window. The Rada of the Ukraine has been suppressed. The Red Army has pushed them out. The Red Army is on the march now. The Red Army is on its way, and now we're going to get the revolution. Now Lenin is really ready to go. Lenin, the Poles have come in, let's push the Poles back. And they start pushing the Poles back out of Russia. The Poles suddenly have an army under Field Marshal Podolsky. And Stalin is in charge of the southern front. Tukhachevsky, a former Tsarist officer, is in charge of the northern front, and the two armies are pushing into Poland. And Stalin is ordered to unite with Tukhachevsky and invest Warsaw. But he doesn't. He says, no, Lvov is more important, and he pushes toward Lvov. Tukhachevsky comes up to Warsaw. According to Lenin, the proletariat will welcome the Red Army, but they don't welcome the Red Army. They form an army under Podolsky, which they have, and they push back against the Red Army, and the Red Army does not conquer Warsaw. So, the Red Army knocked on the door of Warsaw, and the Poles wouldn't let them in. In 1945, the Red Army come up to Warsaw, and the Poles want them to come in because the Germans are there. But the Russians don't come in. They sit outside for 2 weeks while the German army destroys the Polish underground in World War II. Are these two things connected with one another? Okay? But meanwhile, because they couldn't overcome the resistance, they couldn't get through to Warsaw, and they blamed Stalin, and Stalin had to answer for it. He was accused of all these things: ambition, military incompetence, and so on. So Stalin was in deep trouble at this point. Here's the map showing what happened. There's Stalin's army down here pushing toward Lvov and this town, and here is Tukhachevsky. Tukhachevsky was killed in the Stalin purges in the 30s. I don't know. Now, in the end, the Poles pushed them back. Where's my?
We lost the girl again.
I lost my arrow. Oops, I need this all back. And I can talk about this, but maybe you can get it back. Before that thing went blank, there was a clouded area there. They don't get into Warsaw. The Poles push them back, and then the Poles keep pushing them and push them back deep into Russia. Now the Poles are pushing into Russia instead of the Russians pushing into Poland. And they now have to conclude a treaty with the Poles. It's called the Treaty of Riga. The Treaty of Riga. Now he's coming back. Now there's an area there between what the Poles grabbed out of Russia and what the Tsar originally had as part of the imperial army. Let me show you what we have here. This is as far as the this is as far as the Poles went. This dotted line. Well, here it is. This dotted line here. The Poles, as you see, pushed past Kiev. That's in the Ukraine. Finally, when they concluded the Treaty of Riga, this was the line, the so-called Curzon line. It was recommended by the British Foreign Minister, Lord Curzon. Okay? I don't know, this was not the Curzon. The Curzon line is further back. Well, this part of Russia that the Poles now had this. No more. Well, here it is. Okay. The Poles now had this period. In 1939, and I'll talk about this again, when Hitler and Stalin make a pact, this part of Poland goes back to Russia. It's often said that Russia grabbed a piece of Poland in 1939. What Stalin was grabbing was what he lost by not uniting with Tukhachevsky. So you have this back and forth. You have a fast-breaking period as we go from here we are now, 1921, the Treaty of Riga, from December 1916 with the Tsar in power to 4 years later, to March 1921. The world is completely different. And the Soviet power, the Bolshevik power, is now established in Russia. Foreign interveners are out of Russia, and we begin to see the building of the Soviet state. Because I have, well, I'll stop right now. I want to talk a little bit about books, but I'm ready now for anybody to have any questions. Anybody?
How about turning on the lights over at H207?
Yeah.
My grandparents came out of Russia. My grandpa had always talked about the Red Army and the White Army, and they wanted to get him into it and out went. How easy was it to get out of Russia at that time? He went by himself.
You could get out. If you could get across the line, if you could get down to Odessa, you could catch a boat and get out of, get into Turkey and get out. It was harder to get out across into Finland. It was harder to get out across Germany. But if you could get down to Odessa, you had a chance to get out. Anybody else? Any questions up there?
Say, Jack Mechanic, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I'm here.
You know, I think it's quite remarkable that you actually met Kerensky. What was your impression, and how old was he, etc.?
He was in his 80s. I was a graduate student at Stanford, and he was in the Hoover Institute in the Hoover Library, which is on the Stanford campus. And
Hoover Institute.
He was doing research. I think he was writing a book on this period.
Yeah, there was a rumor that he escaped dressed as a woman, which in Stanford he denied.
Yeah.
Or he refused to answer the question.
Right. Well, okay, I'd like to talk to you about some of these books. I'll bring these books up to in the next session. This is a book. Excuse me, you have a question?
Yes.
Yeah.
In many of the movies of the 30s and 40s, they talk about the whites in Paris, in Germany, you know, all of the aristocrats. When did they leave? Did they leave during the war, before the war, before the revolution, after the revolution?
In the period of provisional government, during the period of provisional government, once the Tsar abdicated, there was a mass exodus of these people. And that was the period in which they left. In the little story of Tsar Michael and his wife was one of those who left. And she ended up in Paris. There was a community of emigres, Russian emigres, the so-called whites, in Paris during that period. And that's when they left, before the November Revolution, or the October Revolution. But they could still leave after the October Revolution, but once the Civil War broke out, it was very difficult to leave at that point because you had armies roaming around. You had bands. These were not necessarily organized armies. An interesting book about this period is a book called White Guard by Bulgakov. A story of a family in Kiev who were sort of wedded to the old regime. Okay, this is a book called Okay, this is a book called The Unknown Stalin, written by Roy Medvedev. It has some very interesting background, and some of the things I told you about Stalin's death are recorded in this book. This is an interesting book. This is called Young Stalin. There's no book quite like this one. It just came out about 2 years ago, written by Seaborg, covering the period I went over last year, with many interesting stories about Stalin's activities and some indication of his illegitimate children. While he was in Siberia, he had a child with a young woman up there, and also in one of his other prison experiences in Volgograd, he had a child. He had, as we know, as far as we know, 2 illegitimate, both men. He did help out one of them. I don't know about the other one. If you're going to read about the revolution, if you have any interest in it at all, this book by Sheila Fitzgerald, very small book called The Russian Revolution. She's a professor, she's an Australian, she's a professor at Oxford. Her book is very punchy, very easy to read, and full of some terrific insights. I thought this was a great book. A friend of mine who had in his library the official biography that the Soviets put out. It's just crappy stuff, but it's good to know just exactly what they said. I wouldn't recommend it.
Very thin.
Yeah. This one is the Boy Scout Handbook of Revolution, What is to be Done by V.I. Lenin, written in 1906. It tells you how you have to have a disciplined party in order to succeed. This is a DVD. The first clip that I showed you was from this, not a DVD, this is a VHS, right?
Right.
VHS, that Home Box Office, HBO, put this out some years ago. The actor Robert Duvall plays the role of Stalin. And those pictures of Stalin and his doctor came from this, VHS. You can get this, I think, in libraries, or I can lend it to you. It covers the bare outlines. It's not great material, though. This biography by Edward Rajinsky, he's got some really interesting theories about it. This guy is very imaginative. And one of his theories is that Lenin shot Stalin. That is, Lenin turned Stalin in 1912 when Stalin was last arrested in order to preserve the 6 members of the Duma who were Bolsheviks at the time. And he's got some other interesting twists on it. This one is by Milvan Dijas, and it describes the latest Stalin and some of the goings-on at dinners, as I described before. I have one or two more to show you. This is an excellent book, but I don't think the casual reader would enjoy it, but I did. Adam Ulan, who's a great, he's a Pole, but a very good stylist. It's a record of the foreign policy from the revolutionary times up through the Cold War. But this one's really fun. This one is called The Commissar Vanishes, and it shows you various pictures and how they were doctored among the pictures that I showed last time, and I have a couple of more to show you from this volume. They were constantly changing history by blotting out figures that disappeared. If you remember 1984, one of the slogans in 1984, who controls the past controls the future. And that was what they practiced.
And all of this was before Photoshop.
This was all done, you know, with air spray, etc. Next week, what we'll be covering, yes, sir.
I understand why you rented. You don't understand, and I understand the complex process. That's why are the people on fight?
I think in that period, you had a bayonet at your back. They would come in and pretty much impress you into service. And if you retreat, they would shoot you. It was an old, I mean, that's what the Russians did in Tolstoy's day. You didn't have much choice. When they swept into town and they recruited you, you had to go. And the army would melt, then they would go out and do it all over again, and it went on and on like that. It might have been, you know, it would seem that that kind of an army would be easy to beat. And that might have led Hitler into thinking that they were going to be easy to knock off. He may have been thinking about an army that he would face, but he didn't face that kind of an army. The death of Lenin and the struggle for power among his inheritors. Very interesting, an intriguing story of the double cross. I'll see you then.
Great job.